The air in our designer kitchen was cold, but Julian's voice was like a blade of ice. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He simply leaned back, swirling his vintage Cabernet, and looked at me as if I were a stain on his expensive rug. "You're pathetic, Megan. So desperate for attention, so clingy." He let the word hang there heavy with contempt. "From now on, the rules change. I decide when we meet. I decide when I have time for you. Do you understand?" I looked at the man I was supposed to marry, the man whose business empire I had quietly fortified with my own expertise, and I didn't cry. I didn't beg. Instead, a terrifyingly calm realization washed over me. Julian didn't just want a wife. He wanted a subordinate. "Fine," I whispered, a small, tight smile touching my lips. "Have it your way, Julian." He thought he had won. He thought he had finally broken me into the submissive shadow he desired. But as I walked out of that room, I wasn't retreating, I was divesting. I disappeared into a silence so absolute it would eventually scream louder than any argument. Stay with me, because what Julian didn't realize was that by cutting me off, he was cutting his own safety net. You are about to witness how a woman treated like an asset becomes a liability he never saw coming. From a high-stakes legal trap to a professional betrayal that will leave him breathless. This isn't just a story of a breakup, it is a masterclass in the ultimate cold-blooded payoff. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly what happens when the person you call pathetic is the only one holding your world together. My name is Megan, and at 38, I had built a career as a high-stakes estate planning specialist, a profession that requires a steel-trap mind for detail and an unwavering ability to anticipate disaster before it strikes. I spent my days protecting the legacies of Chicago's most affluent families, ensuring their wealth remained secure against the whims of fate and the greed of others. My life was a testament to order and foresight. Yet, as I stood in the kitchen of the sprawling, glass-walled suburban home I shared with Julian, I realized I had failed to apply those same rigorous standards to my own heart. The evening had begun with the kind of deceptive tranquility that usually precedes a storm, though in our house, the storms never broke with thunder. Julian sat at the mahogany kitchen island, his posture perfect, swirling a glass of vintage Cabernet with a grace that felt increasingly like a weapon. He didn't look like a man about to dismantle a woman's dignity. He looked like a CEO reviewing a quarterly report that had failed to meet expectations. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, curated by him to ensure that when he finally spoke, his words would land with maximum impact. "Megan, we need to address your recent behavior," he said, his voice as clinical as a surgeon's scalpel. There was no anger in his eyes, only a chilling, detached disappointment. This constant need for proximity, the checking in, the expectations for my evening hours, it's frankly pathetic. You've become clingy, and it's a drain on my productivity. I've decided that for this relationship to remain viable, we need a new structure. He paused, not to hear my thoughts, but to let the insult sink in, to watch the word pathetic settle into my bones. He spoke about our engagement as if it were a merger that required restructuring. From now on, he continued, glancing at his watch as if checking a schedule. I will be the one to decide when we meet. I will notify you when I have an opening in my calendar. Do not call me unless it is an emergency of the highest order. This isn't up for debate. It is the new policy. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Any other woman might have shattered or perhaps screamed, but my professional instincts took over. As an estate planning specialist, I am trained to identify toxic assets investments that take more than they give, liabilities that threaten the overall health of the portfolio. Julian wasn't speaking to a partner. He was attempting to manage a resource. He was trying to seize control of the pace, the access, and the emotional capital of our lives. He wanted to be the sole trustee of our relationship, leaving me as a mere beneficiary with no voting rights. Instead of the tears he likely expected, a cold, hard clarity washed over me. I looked at him, really looked at him, and began the process of mental liquidation. I started to tally the accounts. I realized that my agreement to his policy wasn't a surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal. If he wanted to control the access, I would simply revoke his authorization altogether. "Fine, Julian," I said, my voice matching his for its lack of emotion. If that's what you need, I understand. His eyebrows flickered in brief surprise, a momentary glitch in his sense of dominance, before he nodded satisfied that he had successfully fixed the problem of me. But as he turned back to his wine, my mind began to race back through the past 2 years, reevaluating every interaction through this new harsh lens. I saw the red flags I had painted over with the bright colors of hope. I remembered the one-sided dinner dates where I listened for hours to his triumphs while he checked his phone the moment I began to speak about my day. I remembered the belittling jokes he made at cocktail parties, always directed at the complexity of my job, implying that my success was merely a hobby so much smaller than his own. I realized then that he had been demoting me in increments for a long time. Every major decision, from the color of the foyer to the timing of our wedding, had been decided by him under the guise of logic. I had been a fool to think I was his co-pilot. I was merely a passenger he was tired of carrying. He thought he had just won a negotiation, but he didn't realize that in my world, once the trust is breached, we don't just renegotiate, we move toward a total distribution of assets. I stood there in the quiet of our perfect kitchen, watching the man I once loved believe he had Kwai Kung put me in my place. He thought he had secured his power, but he had actually handed me the map to his own undoing. That was the night I understood this wasn't a relationship anymore. It was a system I was expected to obey, and I was about to find the exit strategy. The transition from being his partner to becoming his silent observer happened overnight. Yet Julian was too blinded by his own arrogance to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. In the days following his cold declaration of authority, I didn't pack my bags or scream in defiance. Instead, I initiated a strategic removal of my presence that was as precise as a line-item veto. I stopped being the invisible architect of his comfort. For years, I had functioned as the buffer between Julian and the friction of the real world. I was the one who anticipated his needs, who remembered his mother's birthday, who made sure his favorite dry-cleaned suits were always hanging in the front of the closet, and who seamlessly adjusted my high-stakes meetings to ensure a hot dinner was waiting when he decided to grace the house with his presence. I realized now that I had been providing a professional-grade level of emotional and logistical support for a man who viewed my efforts not as a gift but as an obligation. So I simply stopped. I stopped initiating the morning check-in texts to see how his board meetings had gone. I stopped managing our shared social calendar, letting invitations from his business associates sit unacknowledged in our inbox. I no longer adjusted my high-powered work schedule to accommodate his erratic whims. If he came home late to find the kitchen dark and the refrigerator empty of his specific cravings, I offered nothing but a polite, distant nod from across the room where I sat buried in the complex estate files of a new client. I became a ghost in my own home, a phantom who occupied the space but offered no warmth, no validation, and no access to the inner workings of my mind. It was a clinical divestment, a removal of the emotional currency I had been pouring into a bankrupt account. Julian, however, was thriving on his own ignorance. He watched my silence with a smug, self-satisfied grin, clearly believing that his policy had successfully broken my spirit. In his mind, my lack of protest was the ultimate sign that I had finally learned my place. He moved through the house with an inflated sense of victory. His chest puffed out as he enjoyed what he perceived as the quietude of a well-trained spouse. He told himself that he had finally cured me of my nagging, never pausing to realize that what he had labeled as nagging was actually the vital, life-sustaining maintenance that kept his chaotic personal world from collapsing. He relished the fact that I no longer asked where he had been or why he was late. He misinterpreted my lack of interest as a newfound respect for his autonomy. He would sit in the living room glancing over at me with a patronizing look of approval, unaware that the woman he was looking at was no longer the woman he had proposed to. He was basking in a silence that he thought he had authored, believing he had achieved the perfect low-maintenance relationship where he held all the cards and I held my breath. He enjoyed the power of being the one to decide when we spoke, oblivious to the fact that I had already stopped listening. To Julian, I was finally the submissive asset he had always wanted, a quiet fixture that didn't demand his time or challenge his ego. He felt a renewed sense of dominance every time he walked past me without a word, convinced that he had won a battle I had long since stopped fighting. While he was busy celebrating a victory over a shadow, I was busy reclaiming the woman I had nearly lost. The energy I had previously wasted on managing Julian's ego was now being funneled back into my own career and soul. I began spending late productive nights at the office surrounded by the high-stakes world of Chicago's elite, where my expertise was not only respected but sought after with a premium. I reconnected with my wealthiest clients, individuals who valued my foresight and my ability to navigate the most treacherous legal waters. My professional reputation flourished as I poured my focus into complex trust structures and multi-generational wealth transfers, finding a deep familiar satisfaction in the order and logic of my work that Julian had tried to strip from my personal life. I started waking up early not to prepare his coffee or check his itinerary, but to enjoy long, quiet mornings in the city before the world rushed in. I went to the gym, I met old friends for dinner without checking my phone for his permission, and I realized with a startling clarity that I was never the clingy person he had tried to convince me I was. I had simply been overfunctioning for a man who was fundamentally incapable of meeting me halfway. I was a high-performance engine that had been trying to pull a dead weight, and now that I had unhooked the hitch, I was moving faster and smoother than I had in years. I felt a sense of lightness that was almost intoxicating, a realization that my value was independent of his approval, and my happiness was not a commodity he could regulate. I was rediscovering the rhythm of my own life, a rhythm that was sophisticated, independent, and entirely my own. The house we shared began to feel like a temporary office rather than a home, a place where I was merely completing the final stages of a strategic exit. Every day that Julian spent gloating over my perceived obedience was another day I spent strengthening my own foundations, preparing for the moment when the silence would no longer be a strategy but a permanent state of being between us. He believed my silence meant obedience. I knew it meant I had stepped completely outside his reach. The shift in our domestic landscape was subtle at first, but by the second week of my strategic withdrawal, the cracks in Julian's composure began to widen into chasms. It was a fascinating, if cold, psychological experiment to witness the predator slowly realize he had become the prey of his own design. Having successfully removed the emotional fuel he required to maintain his sense of superiority, I watched as the man who prided himself on ironclad logic started to shatter. The first sign of his unraveling came on a Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a text message, the very thing he had strictly forbidden unless it was an emergency of the highest order. It wasn't an emergency. It was a transparent attempt to reestablish a connection under the guise of a mundane logistics question about a dinner party we weren't even attending. When I didn't respond within his expected 3-minute window, he broke his own policy again by calling me. His voice, once so measured and commanding, now possessed a frantic, interrogative edge that betrayed his growing disorientation. He didn't ask if I was having a good day or if I was feeling well. Instead, he demanded to know where I was and why I hadn't been waiting for him at the house when he swung by between meetings. The calm, scripted reality he had authored for me had been tossed aside, replaced by a desperate need to find the woman he thought he had successfully tethered to his schedule. He was hunting for the Megan who used to apologize for being busy, the Megan who would have dropped everything to reassure him of her devotion. Finding only my absence, he sounded less like a powerful executive and more like a confused child lost in a world where the rules had suddenly changed without his permission. Every time he reached out with this burgeoning, frantic energy, I met him with the gray rock methodology, a technique as clinical and effective as the most rigorous estate audit. I became as uninteresting and unresponsive as a common pebble. My answers were short, polite, and entirely professional, devoid of the emotional hooks he needed to start a fight or claim a victory. When he would corner me in the hallway, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and confusion. Demanding to know why I was being so distant, I would simply look him in the eye and say that I was merely following the guidelines he had established. I offered no anger to fuel his fire, no explanations to soothe his ego, and absolutely no apologies for a change in behavior that he himself had mandated. To a man like Julian, who thrives on the absolute control of another person's emotional state, My sudden indifference was more terrifying than any screaming match could ever be. He was used to me being a mirror that reflected his greatness, a soft place for him to land after a day of corporate warfare. Now, when he looked at me, he saw only a polished, impenetrable surface that offered him nothing back. He was beginning to realize that he no longer knew where he stood in my internal hierarchy. The pedestal he thought he occupied had vanished, leaving him grasping at thin air. I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to reconcile the pathetic and clingy woman he had insulted with the composed, distant professional who now shared his home. He was losing his grip on the narrative, and the more he tried to tighten his hold, the more I seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. Watching Julian's insecurity grow was like watching a specialist monitor a once dominant stock as it began a terminal freefall. There was a grim professional satisfaction in seeing the data points of his arrogance collapse. I didn't need to counterattack or resort to petty vengeance. I simply held my boundaries with the same unwavering resolve I used to protect a client's multi-million-dollar trust. I realized with a profound sense of liberation that Julian's entire sense of power had been an elaborate illusion, a theater production that was entirely dependent on my participation as the supporting actress. Without my reactions to validate his dominance, his performance had no audience and his rules had no weight. He would pace the living room glancing at me as I sat calmly reading a legal brief, his eyes darting with a restless energy that revealed his growing desperation to provoke some kind of emotional response, any response that would prove he still had an effect on me. But I remained a void. I didn't flinch when he raised his voice, and I didn't smile when he tried to soften his tone with a hollow compliment. The more I remained a mystery to him, the more his confidence eroded, replaced by a raw, naked need for the very clinginess he had once claimed to despise. He had thought he was the architect of my life, but he was discovering that he was merely a tenant in a building I had already decided to vacate. The silence I maintained wasn't a wall, it was a mirror reflecting back his own hollowness. He began to look smaller to me, his grand gestures and cutting remarks losing their ability to wound. I was no longer the one seeking validation. He was. Every evening, as the sun set behind the glass walls of our suburban cage, the power continued to leak out of him, leaving behind a man who was increasingly terrified of the quiet he had demanded. He would look at me with a pained, searching expression, as if trying to find a glimmer of the woman who used to hang on his every word, but all he found was a specialist who had already closed the file on him. That's when he started to panic, not because I was gone, but because he couldn't find the buttons he used to press to control me. As the days bled into weeks, Julian's confusion at my indifference began to settle into a new, dangerous form of complacency. He mistook my professional detachment for a total submission to his will, unaware that I was simply allowing him to experience the full weight of his own hubris. For the 3 years we had been together, I had functioned as the silent, invisible engine behind his professional success, a role he was too arrogant to even acknowledge. While he preened in the spotlight of his real estate development firm, I was the one who spent my evenings quietly dissecting his business deals under the soft light of my desk lamp. I had been his primary filter, his unofficial chief legal counsel, and his most effective risk mitigator, all disguised as the supportive fiancé who happened to have a knack for numbers. I lost count of how many times I had steered him away from predatory lenders or spotted trap clauses buried in the fine print of his commercial leases while we sipped wine on the patio. To Julian, my insights were nothing more than annoying input or the fretting of a woman who didn't understand the bold world of high finance. He never once realized that his spotless track record was a direct result of my unpaid expertise. He took my warnings for granted, absorbing my intelligence into his own ego until he truly believed he was the brilliant architect of his own fortune. He saw me as a clingy accessory, never suspecting that I was actually the only thing standing between him and financial ruin. It was the ultimate irony of our relationship. The more I protected him, the more he felt empowered to disrespect me, convinced that his luck was a personal attribute rather than a curated gift from the woman he called pathetic. The moment of truth arrived on a Thursday evening, a night that would eventually serve as the autopsy of his career. Julian came home radiating an aggressive, triumphant energy, carrying a thick, leather-bound folder containing the final contracts for the Sterling Heights development, a massive high-stakes project that he intended to be the crown jewel of his portfolio. It was a deal so large that it required almost every cent of his liquidity and a significant amount of leveraged debt. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he tossed the 200-page document onto the coffee table in front of me, his eyes gleaming with a patronizing sort of kindness. He told me that since I had been behaving so well lately and staying out of his hair, he would let me have a look at the final draft before he signed it the next morning, though he made it clear that he was only doing so to make me feel included. He expected me to do what I had always done: stay up until 2 in the morning cross-referencing every exhibit, highlighting every red flag, and presenting him with a neat list of corrections that he would then claim as his own ideas. I opened the folder, my eyes immediately darting to the first page, and there, it was a devastating, cleverly worded personal guarantee clause. It was a legal landmine that linked Julian's personal assets, our home, and his entire private savings to the performance of the project. If even one subcontractor defaulted or the market dipped by 5%, Julian wouldn't just lose the project, he would be personally wiped out. It was a clause no sane developer would ever agree to, a blatant trap set by the institutional lenders who knew exactly how desperate he was for this win. I felt the familiar urge to reach for my highlighter to explain the catastrophic implications of that single paragraph, but I stopped. I looked up at Julian, who was pouring himself a drink and boasting to his business partner on the phone about how he had finally domesticated me and how much more peaceful his life was now that I knew my place. He laughed a sound full of unearned confidence, and I realized that my retirement, as his protector, was now official. I looked back down at the paper, saw the ruin written in black and white, and simply smiled. I felt no malice, only the cold, clinical detachment of a specialist who had been told her services were no longer required. I closed the folder, slowly smoothing the leather cover with my palm. I didn't say a word about the liability. I didn't mention the risk to our shared future because I already knew that my future would no longer include him. I placed the folder back on the table and told him it looked like exactly the kind of deal he deserved. Julian beamed, mistaking my silence for a total endorsement of his brilliance. He saw my lack of nagging as the final proof that he was the superior mind in the house, a man who had successfully trained his woman to recognize his genius without question. He was so caught up in the theater of his own power that he couldn't see the cliff he was about to walk over. He spent the rest of the evening celebrating his impending triumph, oblivious to the fact that the safety net had been pulled back weeks ago. The next morning, Julian signed the Sterling Heights contract with a flourish of gold ink, his arrogance at an all-time high. He spent the following days in a state of euphoric self-importance, frequently reminding me that his success was a result of his decisive leadership and that I should be grateful to be attached to a man of his caliber. He assumed that because I was quiet, I was finally content to live in his shadow, never realizing that my silence was actually the countdown to his own obsolescence. I watched him move through the world with a terrifying lack of caution, a man who had forgotten how to look for traps because he had spent years relying on someone else to find them for him. I continued to play the role of the polite, distant fiancé while in secret I was finalizing the details of my own departure. I was moving my own assets, securing my own legal standing, and preparing for the inevitable moment when the Sterling Heights deal would begin to unravel. Julian was so busy enjoying the peace and quiet he thought he had won that he failed to notice the subtle shift in the winds of his own empire. He had fired his most valuable consultant, and now he was about to learn the true cost of his logic. He was walking into a financial minefield with his head held high, convinced that he was untouchable because he had silenced the only voice that ever told him the truth. He didn't notice what I stopped doing until the foundation of his empire began to show cracks he didn't know how to fix. The implosion was neither quiet nor subtle. It arrived with the force of a structural collapse that shook the very glass walls Julian had used to house his ego. Within 6 weeks of signing the Sterling Heights contract, the interest rates on his leveraged debt took a sharp, unforeseen climb, and a key subcontractor filed for Chapter 11, triggering the predatory clauses I had spotted on that fateful Thursday night. Julian's lawyers, finally doing the job he thought he was doing himself, delivered the devastating news the personal guarantee clause was ironclad. For the first time in his life, Julian wasn't just looking at a bad quarter. He was looking at the total forfeiture of his personal accounts, our home, and every asset he had spent a decade accumulating. He came into the house that evening looking like a man who had seen his own ghost. His face, a ghostly pallor, his hands trembling as he clutched a stack of legal notices. The mask of the rational, cold fiancé, who had once sat at this very island and called me pathetic, had completely shattered. He cornered me in the kitchen, his voice cracking with a frantic, desperate energy I had never seen before. He began to babble about our future and our problem, begging me to sit down and use my expertise to find a loophole in the language he had so arrogantly signed off on. He was no longer the man who decided when we met. He was a drowning man grasping for the very person he had tried to submerge. He kept repeating my name, pleading with me to do my thing and save us from the ruin he had walked into with his eyes wide shut. It was a pathetic display, a complete reversal of the power dynamic he had tried so hard to cement, as he looked at me not as a partner, but as a lifeline he didn't deserve to hold. I didn't move toward him with comfort, nor did I offer the soothing reassurances of a supportive spouse. Instead, I turned and walked slowly into my home office, gesturing for him to follow. I sat behind my heavy oak desk, the seat of my authority, and waited for him to take the chair opposite me. I didn't treat him as a fiancé, and I didn't treat him as a loved one in crisis. I treated him with the cold, detached professionalism I reserved for a difficult client. When he began to lean over my desk, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of the old Megan, I simply raised a hand to stop him. I informed him in a voice as level and clinical as a court reporter's that since he had redefined our relationship as a series of managed policies, I was now operating under a new policy of my own. I told him that my professional consultation fee was $500 an hour, and currently my firm was not accepting new high-risk clients, especially those with such a blatant disregard for basic risk mitigation. I spoke to him with the exact same detached surgical logic he had used to belittle me weeks prior, reflecting his own rationality back at him until he looked physically ill. The silence he had once used as a weapon was now my shield, and the professional expertise he had dismissed as annoying input was the only currency that mattered in this room. He stared at me, his mouth hanging open, unable to comprehend that the woman he thought he had successfully domesticated was now looking at him as nothing more than a failing investment. I watched him realize that the clingy woman he had insulted was actually the only person who had ever truly protected his wealth from his own arrogance. By devaluing me, he had inadvertently devalued his own security, cutting the very cord that kept him from falling into the abyss. I made it very clear to him that I was leaving not out of a fit of pique or emotional instability, but because the partnership we shared had no equity left. It was a bankrupt entity that I was officially liquidating. I explained that in my world, a man who views his most valuable asset as a liability is a man who is destined for insolvency, and I had no intention of being dragged down by his poor management. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a crisp business card for a reputable bankruptcy attorney I knew, and slid it across the mahogany surface toward him. I told him he should call them immediately, as he had precisely 48 hours before the bank initiated the foreclosure on the very house we were standing in. Julian looked down at the card and then back at me, the realization finally dawning on him that he had lost everything, not because of the market and not because of the lenders, but because he had been too small a man to cherish the woman who was big enough to save him. He sat there in the chair, looking diminished and hollow, while I stood up with a sense of freedom that was absolute. I had already packed my essentials, and my new apartment was waiting for me in the city, a space where my name was the only one on the lease and my logic was the only one that mattered. I walked past him without a backward glance, leaving him alone in the office I had outgrown. That was the moment he realized he couldn't put me back where I used to be because I had outgrown the very room he tried to keep me in. The aftermath of my departure wasn't a sudden explosion, but rather the quiet, steady erosion of a foundation that Julian had never bothered to understand. It turns out that when you remove the silent architect from a structure built on vanity, the collapse is inevitable. Over the following months, I watched from a distance as Julian's world began to shrink one lost opportunity at a time. Without my social and professional maintenance, the polished image he had presented to the world started to fray at the edges. His reputation, once built on the illusion of impeccable judgment, began to dwindle as he stumbled through business meetings without the comprehensive briefings I used to provide. He missed deadlines, overlooked critical tax implications, and alienated long-standing associates with an abrasive arrogance that no longer had my diplomatic buffer to soften the blow. His bank account followed suit, drained by the legal fees and penalties of the Sterling Heights disaster he had so confidently walked into. He wasn't destroyed by any act of sabotage on my part. He was simply destroyed by the vacuum I left behind. He was left alone in that large glass-walled house, a structure that felt increasingly like a hollow monument to a man who had everything and valued nothing. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he spent his evenings in darkened rooms trying to make sense of contracts that now looked like gibberish without my marginalia to guide him. He had sought a life where he decided every rule, and he finally had it, except the only thing left for him to rule was an empty estate and a mounting pile of debt. The silence he once demanded as a sign of my obedience had become his permanent companion, a reminder that the clingy woman he had dismissed was actually the only thing that made his life feel like a home. 3 months after I closed that door for the last time, I sat in my new office, a boutique consultancy nestled in the heart of the city, where the skyline felt like an invitation rather than a cage. I had successfully divested from a bad investment and redirected every ounce of my capital, emotional, intellectual, and financial, back into myself. My new firm specialized in helping women in late-life divorces or difficult transitions protect their assets and claim their own legacies. I had become the picture of the strength I had always possessed but had previously used to fortify a man who didn't deserve it. My days were now filled with the gratitude of women who, like me, had been told they were secondary characters in their own lives. I wasn't just winning a fight. I was building a new legacy of American elegance and independence. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman whose skin was glowing not from expensive creams, but from the sheer relief of no longer carrying the weight of someone else's insecurity. I moved through the world with a sophisticated calm, my expertise now commanding a premium that no one dared to call annoying. My apartment was a sanctuary of my own design, filled with art he would have hated, and a silence that I cherished because it was mine to curate. I had realized that the most profitable move I ever made was the moment I stopped trying to balance a ledger that was designed to keep me in the red. I was no longer a managed resource. I was the primary stakeholder in a life that was finally yielding a return on my own terms. As I look back on the night Julian tried to dictate the terms of my existence, I realize that our entire relationship was a lesson in the true nature of power. Most people think power is the ability to command a room to yell the loudest, or to force another person into a state of submission. Julian certainly thought so. He believed that by restricting my access and belittling my value, he was cementing his position at the top of our hierarchy. But real power, the kind that survives the shifting tides of fortune and the arrogance of men, is the quiet, unwavering ability to walk away from anything that no longer serves your value. It is the strength to realize that you are the one holding the keys even when the other person thinks they own the door. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just needed to stop speaking to a man who had stopped listening. The ultimate revenge wasn't a lawsuit or a public scandal. It was simply letting Julian experience a life that was exactly what he asked for, a life without me. I let him have his rules, his logic, and his clinical policies. And in doing so, I showed him that a man who doesn't respect the source of his strength is destined to be weak. The audience of my life had changed, and as the curtain rose on this new chapter, I felt a deep, resonant empowerment that came from knowing I was finally free. I had survived the betrayal and the humiliation, and I had emerged not just intact, but improved. I had redefined my own worth, and in the process, I had left behind a man who was still trying to find the buttons to a machine that had already left the building. He thought deciding when we met and how I spoke made him powerful. Letting go of me showed how fragile that power really was, because in the end, I wasn't his asset, I was the architect. If Megan's story of reclaiming her power and professional worth has inspired you today, please consider subscribing to our channel so you never miss a tale of ultimate justice and personal transformation. We believe that every woman has an inner architect waiting to be unleashed, and your support helps us continue sharing these empowering narratives with the world. We are also incredibly curious to hear your perspective on Julian's downfall. Do you believe that silence is truly the most powerful response to a partner who tries to control you, or should Megan have confronted him even sooner? Perhaps you have witnessed a similar situation where someone's unpaid expertise was only recognized after they walked away. Some of our viewers have previously mentioned that the best revenge is living well, while others argue that the financial consequences Julian faced were the only language a man like him would ever truly understand. We want to know what you think. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on whether Megan's clinical divestment was the right move or if you would have handled it differently. Your insights and stories are what make this community so vibrant and strong. Don't forget to hit the notification bell after you subscribe so you can be the first to join our next discussion. Thank you for watching, for sharing your wisdom in the comments, and for standing with us as we celebrate the strength of women who know their worth and aren't afraid to protect it.